Hi, guys. Welcome to Title Talk Tuesday. This is your host, Jerry Wu, your title specialist here at First American Title. And wanted to welcome you guys back to another installation of this special program talking specifically about title insurance related to real estate, residential, commercial, and so forth. Today, the topic that I wanted to share with you guys has to do with vesting. Now, if you've ever bought a property, maybe you bought it by yourself, maybe you had somebody else on title with you. Escrow would always give you what's called a vesting worksheet. And what that really is, vesting, it's another fancy way of saying estate planning. Okay, so before I continue on this topic, I just wanted to give a quick disclaimer. You know, when we're talking about vesting, estate planning, there's really a lot of legal and tax ramification that comes from this. So, again, your realtor or your title specialist, we're not attorneys. We don't give legal advice. However, I do think it's important that the buyer of any real estate transaction has a good enough idea or general idea of the different ways of holding title, meaning the different ways of how they should vest their title or vest their property. And I'll go into more details and explanation later of the differences, but I at least wanted to start out this segment with that little disclaimer because it is important. I mean, we have attorneys, estate planning attorneys that really specialize in nothing but this type of stuff. So it does get pretty detailed. It does get pretty extensive. So with that said, let me continue and talk a little bit about how you can hold title when you purchase a property. Now, or if you're purchasing property by yourself, if you're the only one that's going to be on title, well, that's pretty straightforward. That's pretty simple. Okay, so the first scenario is you're a single man or a single woman. Now that's the most easiest, the most straightforward way. Let's say your name is John Doe, then you're buying property. The title of your property is going to read John Doe, a single man. That's it. The title of your property, if you look at the actual grant deed of your property, it's just going to say John Doe, a single man. So another way of holding title by yourself is John Doe, an unmarried man. Okay, now the only difference is an unmarried man is somebody that's been legally divorced. So the joke is if you've been married, you're never single again. And the third way is John Doe, a married man, as his sole and separate property. So obviously, in this method, John Doe is married, but he's only holding title by himself. His wife is not on title with him. So if that were the case, if he wants to hold title as John Doe, a married man, as his sole and separate property, his wife, Jane Doe, for example, would need to sign a quitclaim deed deeding her interest off. So again, if John Doe wants to hold title by himself as a married man, his wife would need to deed her interest off. Now, there are some rare occasions where a married man or a married woman can hold title by themselves without their spouse signing a quitclaim or interspousal grant deed. However, when that property comes time to sell, if the title company did not see a interspousal deed from the spouse, they're going to require one at the time of sale. So, you know, you may be able to buy a property without your spouse signing a quick, you may be able to buy a property by yourself as a married person without your spouse signing a quitclaim deed under certain scenarios. However, sooner or later, your spouse is going to be required to sign a quitclaim deed. So if you're holding title by yourself, those are the most simplistic three methods. Now, keep in mind when you hold title by yourself, we're talking about remember estate planning, investing. What happens to the property after you pass away? If you're holding title by yourself as John Doe, a single man, and you were to pass away, that property is going into probate. So just something to keep in mind. Okay. Now, another way of holding title is under your trust. So segueing into that, a trust is a great way of holding title. I mean, because you basically have everything lined up in a scenario where you're unable to act as the seller or maybe the trustee. Now, keep in mind, every trust there's three roles. Okay, so you may have a trust called John Doe Family Trust. Okay, you went to an attorney and you created a trust called John Doe Family Trust, and you want to buy your house using John Doe Family Trust. That's absolutely okay. Now, in every trust, there are essentially three roles. You have your trustor, basically a person who created a trust. You have your beneficiary, which is pretty self explanatory. And you have your trustee, meaning the person in charge of this trust. A lot of the times, the trustee and trustor could be the same person. The trustee is also the same person that would sign all the documents relating to a real estate sale if the property is under a trust. From a title company perspective, whenever we see a property held under a trust and it's going to sale, we're going to see who the trustee is because that's the person that we're going to require to sign all the relevant documents. If this particular trustee has passed away, for example, let's say our original trustee was our John Doe, right? It was a John Doe trustee of the John Doe Family Trust. And in this example, let's say our trustee, John Doe, has passed away. Then the title company is going to require to see a copy of the John Doe Family Trust to see who is the successor trustee. And then if that successor trustee can't act, then there'll probably be a successor to the successor trustee. So in a way, a trust is a very good way of holding title because it kind of lays out everything. There's no questions to go with that. Now, also keep in mind, sometimes I get a question like, "Hey, I have my property in a trust, but I want to sell it and I want to use a power of attorney." In general, most of the time, if your property is held under a trust, the trust does not allow a power of attorney to be used unless it is specified in the trust that a power of attorney can be used, which is very rare. So just something to keep in mind because if you think about it, the power of attorney sort of defeats the purpose of a trust, right? So just something to be aware of. So that's another way of holding title, of course, is you can hold it under your company name. Perhaps you have an LLC or you have a corporation. That's also possible. Okay, moving on. Now, co-ownership. What if you're buying property and you want to hold title under two or more people? Well, I've included a little workshop. Hopefully you can see it, but there is generally now four ways of vesting. So let's say we have John Doe and Jane Smith buying the property together. Okay, John Doe and Jane Smith is buying property together, and escrow is going to ask them, how do you want to hold title? How do you want to vest? How do you want your vesting to be? There are four options. First is called tenancy in common, then joint tenancy, and community property or right of survivorship. So it might sound something like this. John Doe, a single man, and Jane Smith, a single woman, together as joint tenants. A title might be held in that fashion. Or it may be John Doe and Jane Doe, husband and wife, together as community property with right of survivorship. Could be held in that fashion. Now, the worksheet that I've supplied kind of goes over the main differences between these four options, but I'll give you a quick overview on some of the key things that at least most people in my experience pay attention to when they decide between or amongst these four options. Now, let's say two people are buying title and they say they want to hold title under different interests. For example, party A says, I want to have 70% interest, and party B says, I want to have 30% interest. Well, that's a pretty simple one because it kind of just defaults to tenancy in common. Because tenancy in common is the only choice out of these four that allows different interests to be held by the parties involved. However, tenancy in common also does not have any right of survivorship benefits. And what I mean by that is, let's say party A has 70% interest. If party A were to pass away, party A's 70% would need to be probated. Again, if party A were to pass away, his 70% or his or her 70% would need to go to probate. It does not just automatically go to party B. Now, moving on then to joint tenant. Okay, so party A and B wants to hold title together as joint tenants. Now, joint tenants does have an automatic right of survivorship benefit. However, you have to hold title as a whole, meaning you cannot anymore have 70%, 30%. It has to be two people have to be held title. I'm sorry, two people have to hold title as a whole. It could be three people, 4 people, so forth. Now, so what I mean by the right of survivorship benefit is, again, let's say it's just A and B. If A were to pass away, B would have the capability to do anything he or she wants. He can sell, he can refinance, and that would be perfectly fine. So really all that's needed is if A were to pass away, B would just have to have a death certificate for A and also what's called an affidavit of death to joint tenant recorded, and now B, him or her, owns the property altogether. So joint tenants used to be a really popular way for husband and wives, actually, until recently. Now, you might notice that there's a community property and community property of right or survivorship. Now, before I say anything, community property is usually just reserved for spouses to be used. So husband and wife, husband, husband, wife, wife, only reserved for husband and wife to be used. Now, let's start with community property of right of survivorship. Okay, property of right of survivorship has that automatic right of survivorship just like joint tenant does. Okay, except it has a few better tax advantage when it relates to capital gains tax when you sell the property. So it has to do with what's called a step-up tax basis. I'm not going to go into the details of the step-up tax basis because that's mostly a CPA type of thing. But just know that if you're husband and wife and you want that automatic right of survivorship benefit, it's worth taking a look into holding title as community property of right of survivorship because you do get that automatic right of survivorship benefit that most husband and wife seek, and you get a better tax advantage if you were to ever sell the property one day because of the step-up tax basis. Again, it's not a recommendation, but it's good to look into if if you're buying property as husband and wife. Now, the main difference between community property of right of survivorship and just regular community property is the automatic right of survivorship. So obviously, community property of right of survivorship has an automatic right of survivorship benefit, whereas regular community property has that unless otherwise devised by will. So unless otherwise devised by will. Both of them do, though, however, community property and community property of the right of survivorship has that step-up tax base advantage. Again, really look that up. You can just do a Google search for step-up tax or a YouTube search, and you'll find a lot of information about that. So those are the most common ways of holding title. Again, that worksheet is really going to help you see the main differences between all these different ways. And depending on how you hold title is going to sort of determine what happens to your property if you were to pass away, what are the tax ramifications, and so forth. So really important, ask the right questions either to your real estate professional, to your estate planning attorney, to your CPA to make sure you get your property vested in the correct way when you purchase it. You can also change the way you hold title. You can also change your vesting after you purchase the property by basically recording another deed, changing the title, or changing the way you hold title to your property. So that concludes this new segment. Hopefully this information was helpful. Again, my name is Jerry Wu. I'm your host. Thank you so much for listening. I'll speak to you guys next time.